2 years ago, I was working for a company that measured houses. Most people haven't heard of it. It's where you essentially use an iPad to draw up floor plans and measure rooms for carpet or hardwood flooring projects. Anyone can request a measurement. At the time, I was 25 and one of the few women in this position. I was really good at the job, so I was given a lot of work, usually measuring between 10 to 14 houses a day, driving all over multiple towns. This particular house was my last one of the day, in the middle of nowhere, and I was exhausted. When I arrived, I was already annoyed because the customer wasn't home and was late for the appointment. 10 minutes later, he pulled up next to my car. He was a middle-aged man, balding, wearing typical office attire with a tie. He seemed a bit awkward but was apologetic and let me into his home. Upon entering, I noticed the house was unbelievably spotless and organized, minimal furniture, and it smelled like cleaning supplies. It didn't strike me as odd at first. He had 2 cats lounging in the living room. The first sign of strange behavior came when I started measuring the first bedroom. He mentioned, "Wow, my cats love you. They don't usually take to strangers like this." But his cats hadn't moved or come near me at all. I just smiled and nodded while I worked on scaling out the master bedroom on my iPad. Then, he started asking about the electronics I was using. "Do they keep track of where you are on that thing?" Red flag. "Yes, my boss knows how long each job should take based on the scope of work. It's incredible technology." I lied without missing a beat. He agreed that it was amazing. Then he chuckled and said, "Be careful. Don't touch the gun on the nightstand. It might go off." Immediate spine chill. I looked up from my iPad and sure enough, there was a handgun on the nightstand. I knew instantly that I needed to act like nothing was alarming me. He directed me to the second bedroom, and he said the exact same thing, warning me about a gun on the nightstand, which was indeed there. This was when I knew I was in danger. At first I thought it was just my anxiety around guns, but by this point, the tension between us was undeniable. There were only 2 bedrooms on the scope of work, so I met him in the kitchen to go over the next steps. But he interrupted me. "Could you measure the basement stairs? I forgot to add them to the list and I think I might want to carpet them in the future." My heart dropped. But my customer service trained brain couldn't figure out how to say no. He led me to the basement door and let me tell you, there was no way he was planning on doing anything with these stairs. They were plank wooden stairs, L-shaped, leading down to an unfinished basement. Unfortunately, to get an accurate measurement, I had to walk all the way down. He stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the doorway with a smile, asking again if my boss knew where I was. I quickly replied, "Yes." When I reached the basement, I scanned the room. There were 7 deep freezers lining the walls, a single low-hanging light, an old TV, VHS tapes scattered on the floor, and an old recliner facing the TV. Behind the TV were 2 white shelves full of VHS tapes. In that moment, I knew one of 2 things was going to happen. He was either going to let me go, or he was going to push me down the stairs. I held my breath, kept a smile on my face, and began climbing the stairs. All I could hear was my heartbeat in my ears. He was still blocking the door, no smile this time. As I reached the 5th stair from the top, I felt him hesitate, which made me hesitate too. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. To my absolute shock and relief, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped aside. I made a beeline for the front door, not saying a word. But he stopped me again. "Oh, before you go, won't you give my cats a treat? They loved you so much." He was holding a bag of cat treats. I quickly gave his cats a treat, thanked him, and practically ran out of the house, and definitely ran to my car. The second I left his driveway, I had an intense panic attack and started crying. I tried to call my boss, but I was in a dead zone. The truth is, my boss wouldn't have noticed I was missing for at least 24 hours when I didn't route my day for the next workday. Yes, they would have eventually caught him, as it was my last known location, but by then, I would have been long gone. I suffered PTSD from the experience and couldn't sleep for a week. I was terrified to go back to work, but I had no choice. This day still haunts me. The worst part? I was so shaken and in denial about the experience that I forgot to write down his address. When my best friend, at the time, and I were seniors in high school, around 2016, we went on a weekend trip to visit my grandmother, who lived a couple of hours away from my town in Georgia, USA. The town we lived in was relatively small for the state, but was one of the largest within a few hours. To get to my grandmother's place, we had to travel about 2.5 hours through tiny, somewhat rural towns. On our way back home, we had to stop at a gas station literally in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking cornfields, cotton fields, streets with no signs or lights, not even stop signs, and definitely no cell service. The convenience store attached to the gas station had a few snacks inside, but it looked deserted from the outside. There were no other cars or people in sight, so we didn't bother getting anything other than gas. I paid with my card, mainly because I didn't want to leave my 5'1", 100-pound friend alone in the car while I went inside. Another car pulled up on the other side of the single gas pump just as I started pumping gas. Given all the creepy stories I'd read, I already had a weird feeling. I decided to stay alert, standing outside my car with the driver's side door open so my friend could see and hear everything going on. A thin, late-50s man got out of his car and appeared to be paying at the pump. After a few seconds, though, he walked around the pump and maneuvered himself around my car door to stand within a foot of me. He asked if he could pump my gas for me. The gas nozzle was locked, so it was pumping without me having to hold it. I immediately placed myself between the open door and the man, preparing to either shut the door with me inside or move and slam it behind me to protect my friend if necessary. I calmly told him, "It's fine, no thank you." He looked me up and down with the corner of his lip tilted up and said, "Pretty girls like you shouldn't be out here all alone. You definitely shouldn't have to do this by yourself. Let a man help you, baby." He then covered my hand with his own as he reached for the gas pump I was holding. I jerked my hand away and slammed my car door shut, thinking the last thing I'd want was for him to jump in and drive away with my friend still inside. At that moment, the warning signs went from orange to red. My usually polite demeanor shifted as I remembered something I'd read online. It's better to be safe and seem rude than be polite and uncomfortable. I turned serious and said, "Sir, get away from me. I can pump my own gas and I've already said no thank you. Leave us alone." He didn't move. He raised his chin, making eye contact with me, his lip tilt gone. I stared him down and figured I had enough gas to get us far enough away. Maintaining eye contact, I pulled the nozzle out and threw it back onto the pump. Without waiting for him to react, I got in my car and drove away before he had even moved. As we drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror and realized that his car wasn't even being filled with gas. He must have just been driving by and decided to help a damsel in distress. My friend was shaking the whole way home, telling me she would have let the man pump her gas. I was just glad that some of the confidence I'd gained from reading scary stories helped me stay attentive and respond assertively enough to get us out of that situation. I used to ride a motorcycle as my sole method of transportation when I was studying, and I worked in hotel cocktail bars during the summer holidays. 6 years ago, I was working at a historic, stereotypically grand hotel in a very rural area of the UK. I worked a long afternoon and evening, finishing up late into the night. After cleaning up the bar around 2 a.m., I walked through the underbelly of the hotel to retrieve my motorcycle and begin the journey home. I still clearly remember the feeling of the crisp night air and the absolute pitch-black silence of the countryside after hot, seemingly endless nights serving drinks to dinner-goers and party-goers. It was always intensely relaxing, now that being an adult meant no longer fearing the dark or riding a motorcycle in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. Riding through the local town took me just a few minutes before I hit the dark country roads on my way home. At the time, I rode a Honda 125cc with about 11 horsepower. It was basic and old but clean and did the job despite its quirks, like a dim headlight that flickered even more when I came to a stop. I was riding along these pitch-black roads, surrounded by fields and woods, very much alone for about 20 minutes. Suddenly, I saw a brief flash of bright blue headlights in my mirrors from behind. Moments later, dazzling headlights caught up to me in seconds. Almost immediately, a large Range Rover overtook me, blasting past barely inches away from my bike. In response, I gave a long blast on my horn. Big mistake. The Range Rover swerved in front of me and slammed on its brakes, seemingly trying to make me lose control or rear-end the vehicle. Even though my bike was old and relied on drum brakes, motorcycles can stop quickly, so I managed to come to a controlled stop without crashing into the back of the car. I saw the driver's door of the Range Rover crack open, and a figure began to step out. I went for it, using all 11 horsepower of the little Honda, overtaking quickly. However, in those moments, the driver had shut his door and floored the accelerator, putting us side by side as I reached his car. He then began swerving toward me, trying to run me off the road, forcing me closer to the ditch at the side of the road. I struggled to control the bike on the wet, dew-covered grass, trying to stop the motorcycle from falling into the ditch. Somehow I managed to regain balance and pull the bike back onto the road. At this point, I noticed the driver had gotten out of the Range Rover again. He walked around to the back, opened it, and began reaching inside. I quickly turned the bike to face the opposite side of the road, ready to escape in either direction. Just as I was about to take off, I glanced back at him one more time and saw him pulling out a large, long object from the back of the Range Rover. I didn't hesitate. I took off, glancing over my shoulder after about 200 meters, only to see that he had gotten back into his vehicle and was driving up the road, away from where I had run off. I slowed down to see what he would do next. He reached the top of the road and pulled over to the left, waiting for me, his headlights reflecting off the road in a chilling, eerie way. My heart was pounding, yet it felt like time had stopped. I didn't stick around. I continued in the opposite direction, looking for an alternative route home through the pitch black. Just before I did, I checked my phone for signal. Nothing. No mobile coverage at all. I must have been about 9 years old when this happened. My mom was a single mom and I had a much older brother who lived away from home, and we basically lived in the middle of nowhere, just the two of us. Our closest neighbor was about 15 minutes away by running, certainly not within shouting distance. We lived along an old main road that ran past our house. Maybe 2 or 3 cars would pass in the evening, those heading into the local town or trying to avoid the main road. Our nights were almost always very quiet. It was the kind of place where if there was a knock on the door, your blood ran cold for a few seconds. Usually it was someone who was lost, or occasionally someone who had crashed their car on the winding road. For some reason at the time, probably because we couldn't afford it, we had no curtains. There were these huge windows along both walls of our living room. It would creep me out when I was alone, but with my mom, I felt okay. One Friday night, I was sitting with my mom watching a movie in our PJs with our dog, as was our weekend tradition. It was dark and must have been late, and then we heard a knock at the door. We did the obligatory double take, instantly freaking out for a second, but my mom, being the parent, acted calm, so I calmed down too. She headed to the door with me following closely behind, hiding behind the fridge. She unlocked the door and opened it. No one was there. My mom immediately slammed the door. I started silently panicking and looked at her for an explanation. She gave me a weak excuse about a deer running into the door, which I obviously didn't believe, but I didn't argue either. She convinced herself everything was fine and sent me off to bed. The next night, Saturday, I had pretty much forgotten about the night before, and I think my mom had convinced herself it didn't happen. But as you can guess, the knock came again. This time, I instantly remembered the previous night, and a chill ran through me. If you've ever seen your parents look really scared when you're little, you know there's nothing more terrifying. My mom tried to act normal, and we made our way to the front door. I hid again. And again, no one was there. My mom slammed the door shut. This time, it really freaked us both out. As I mentioned, our living room had huge windows on both sides. When the lights were on inside, we couldn't see outside, but anyone outside could see us. The living room was at the center of the house and had the only phone, right in front of one of the big windows. The thought of walking into that room with someone potentially watching us was beyond creepy. We sat in the kitchen for a while after scrambling to close the kitchen blinds, which we never usually bothered with because they looked out onto the forest behind the house. Eventually, my mom had to do something. She told me it was probably just kids, though even as a child, I knew she was grasping at straws. She headed to the phone to call the police. The police eventually turned up, did a walk around the property, after saying, "Ooh, that's creepy," right to our faces, and found nothing. They gave us a number to call if it happened again. The same thing happened for the next 3 nights. The police came each time, but we lived so far out that whoever it was always disappeared by the time they arrived. At this point, my mom was terrified. I can't even imagine how scary it was for her, living alone with just me in the house. so the police agreed to do a stakeout at our house that night. There was a little country path off the main road that ran in front of our house, so they set up there, just around the corner with their lights off. It was either a Friday again, or I was just allowed to stay up. It was exciting, but so scary for a little kid. During the stakeout, the police observed a man turn off his lights and engine a few feet up the road from our house and roll into the side road in front of us, giving him a perfect view of our living room. He sat there for 2 hours, watching our house, before finally getting out and sneaking up to the front door. That's when the police pounced on him and arrested him. It turned out he was a creepy man who lived several towns away, at least 20 miles or so, and would come just to watch my mom at night and freak her out by knocking on the door. In September 2010, my boyfriend Dave, his best friend Tony, my best friend Liz, and I were all returning to our hometown for our final year of college after spending the summer in London. We had an amazing time, staying in my uncle's apartment, partying, and exploring such a big city. It was great. We stopped at a B&B about halfway home, planning to get back around 6 p.m. We woke up early, around 4 or 5, ready to set off again, when we discovered that someone had driven too close to our car and broken the right wing mirror off. Since this car was a birthday present from my dad and I'd had it for barely 2 months, I was absolutely fuming. We asked the landlady where we could possibly find spares or something temporary to use. She said she'd driven past a makeshift scrapyard a while back. She wasn't sure if it was still there, but she drew us a rough map, and we got back on the road. I wasn't entirely sure she was right, because the closer we got to the area she circled, the more desolate it became. The roads turned from stone to dirt, and there were no farms, just long, weedy grass and patches of forest. It had basically turned into a moor. We were about to give up because of the wild animals, and I resigned myself to dealing with the missing wing mirror when my boyfriend pointed ahead to a handwritten sign directing us 2 miles down the road to a cafe and car spares. We drove down into a little cove surrounded by forest and all got out, except for Liz, who was asleep in the back seat. There was a tiny cream hut with cafe spray-painted on the roof, a caravan, and a hill of metal and car parts. As expected, we were the only ones there. The sun was up, but there were no lights or people around, so I guess they were still sleeping. It was only about 6 a.m. We all walked up to the scrap pile, and I rummaged through it, looking for a wing mirror or anything that could work temporarily. Tony picked up a mirror that must have been at least a decade old and suggested we just take it and go, but me, being my sincere self, insisted on paying for it. I knocked on the door and waited. A large, hard-faced man answered, looking pissed off and tired at first, but then he smiled at me with a two-toothed grin. He leered at me for a few seconds, but when the boys approached, he asked what we wanted. Tony handed him the mirror and asked how much it was. He said nothing, just that he wanted to get to know us. I thought fair enough. Then 2 more men came out from the patio door. Both were skinheads with teeth like meth addicts, and they stank. They took the mirror and went to attach it to the car. The first man, who introduced himself as Ian, invited us to sit down on the patio chairs and offered us sandwiches. I politely declined, but he insisted we must be hungry, telling me that women are best at making sandwiches. I declined again, feeling a little annoyed by the sexist comment. When he asked again, Dave sternly reiterated that I didn't want to go inside. Ian muttered something under his breath and sat down with us. Things got awkward quickly as he started asking questions. At first they were innocent enough, how old we were, where we were from, but then they got uncomfortable. He asked if I had a boyfriend, Dave answered, and then started asking inappropriate questions about our relationship, things like how often we had intercourse. We didn't answer and sat in uncomfortable silence until we suddenly heard Liz scream. We turned around to see one of the men, who was supposed to be fixing the mirror, with his hand through the back window grasping Liz's leg. The other man was nervously looking around the car. We immediately sprinted off the patio. Tony chased after the men, but they both ran into the forest. Liz was hysterical. She had woken up to find herself alone in the car with a strange man's hand running up her leg. I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been for her. I got into the back seat with her to console her while Dave checked the car. He pointed out that there were nails on the ground, arranged around the tire. There were about 12 of them, clearly set up to pop the tire. At the time, I couldn't figure out why, but now I wonder how they got all those car parts. We decided we had had enough, Mirror or no mirror, we were ready to leave. Tony was the last to get into the car, and as he closed the back seat door, we saw Ian re-emerge from the house, holding something long. He started running toward us. As he got closer, my vision adjusted, and I realized he was holding a rifle. A hunting rifle. At that point, I burst into tears and hit the engine, slamming on the accelerator as hard as possible. We sped off, reaching about 90 miles, driving over dirt roads and whatever else, just trying to get out of there. We didn't stop or look back until we were safely on the motorway, heading home. To this day, whenever I go to London, I take the train instead.